A black teen helped a lost old man in expensive clothes when everyone else walked past. The next morning, a luxury car pulled up to her house. Sarah's alarm buzzed at 4:30 a.m., and her hand shot out from under the worn blanket to silence it before it could wake the neighbors through the thin walls. The small apartment was dark and cold. They kept the heat low to save money. She sat up, her feet finding her old slippers in the darkness. The floorboards creaked as she made her way to the kitchen, moving carefully past her mother's room. The coffee maker sat ready on the counter, prepped the night before. Sarah reached for the light switch but stopped herself. No need to waste electricity when the streetlight outside gave enough glow to work by. "Baby, you up?" Her mother's tired voice came from the bedroom. "Yeah, Mom. Go back to sleep. Your coffee will be ready in 10. Sarah heard her mother shift in bed. "You don't have to do this every morning. You know." "I want to," Sarah replied, measuring the coffee grounds. The scent filled the small kitchen, rich and familiar. "Besides, you need decent coffee for those double shifts." Her mother appeared in the doorway, already in her nursing scrubs. Her hair was wrapped in a silk scarf, and dark circles lined her eyes. "I remember teaching you how to make coffee," she said, watching Sarah work. "You were so little, had to stand on a chair to reach the counter. And I still make it better than you," Sarah grinned, pouring the hot water in careful circles. "Girl, please." Her mother laughed softly. "But you're right about that." Sarah handed over the steaming mug, and her mother took a long sip. "Perfect," she sighed. "Did you finish that history paper?" "Yeah, stayed up till 11, but it's done." Sarah started making her own cup. "Mr. Peterson said it might help my scholarship application." Her mother's face softened. "You're working so hard, baby." "Sometimes I worry, Dash." "Don't," Sarah cut in. "We're doing fine. You work hard too." They shared a quiet moment in the pre-dawn darkness, drinking coffee and listening to the city wake up outside. A car horn honked somewhere in the distance. Their upstairs neighbor's shower turned on, pipes groaning. "I better get going," her mother said, rinsing her mug. "You got your bus fare?" Sarah nodded. "And lunch money. Tips were good yesterday." Her mother pulled her into a tight hug. "Love you, baby. Be safe." "Love you too, Mom. Take care of those patients." After her mother left, Sarah got ready for her own day. The coffee shop opened at 6:30, and she needed to be there by 6 o'clock to help set up. She changed into her black work pants and green employee shirt, tucking a textbook into her backpack for slow periods. The street was quiet as she locked the apartment door. A few early workers hurried past, bundled against the autumn chill. The bus stop was 3 blocks away, past the convenience store where Mr. Chen was already setting up his newspaper display. "Morning, Sarah," he called out. "Cold today." She waved back, picking up her pace. The sky was just beginning to lighten, turning the clouds a pale gray. Her breath made small clouds in the air. The coffee shop was already humming when she arrived. Jenny, the morning manager, was counting register drawers. "There you are," Jenny said, looking up. "Can you start on the pastry case?" Tyler called in sick again. Sarah dropped her bag in the break room and tied on her apron. The morning rush would start soon, office workers wanting their caffeine fix before heading downtown. She arranged muffins and croissants in neat rows, checking expiration dates and inventory levels. The bell above the door chimed at 6:30 exactly. Mr. Williams walked in, right on schedule. He ordered the same thing every morning, medium dark roast, no room for cream. "The usual?" Sarah asked, already reaching for a cup. "You know it." He smiled, pulling out his wallet. "Still studying for those college applications?" "Yes, sir, every chance I get." He dropped his change in the tip jar. "Keep at it. Smart girl like you. You'll go far." The morning rush built steadily. Sarah moved on autopilot, taking orders, making drinks, restocking supplies. During a brief lull, she pulled out her textbook, reviewing chemistry equations while wiping down counters. "You know," Jenny said, passing by with a box of coffee sleeves, "most kids your age are on their phones during breaks." Sarah shrugged. "Can't afford to waste time. SATs are coming up." The day continued its usual pattern. Regular customers came and went. Sarah made drinks, cleaned tables, and squeezed in study time where she could. By the end of her shift at 2:30, her feet ached and her green shirt had coffee stains despite the apron. "Good job today," Jenny said as Sarah clocked out. "You sure you don't want more hours?" "I could use the help. Thanks." But I need the study time. Sarah shouldered her backpack. See you tomorrow. Outside, the autumn afternoon was bright and crisp. Sarah started her walk home, planning to stop at the library to return some books. She was tired, but it was a good kind of tired, the kind that came from working towards something better. As she walked, Sarah noticed how the neighborhood changed block by block. The coffee shop was in a nice area, with clean sidewalks and well-kept storefronts. But as she headed toward home, the buildings grew older, the sidewalks more cracked. She didn't mind. This was her world, and she knew every corner of it. The library would have to wait. Dark clouds were gathering overhead, and Sarah didn't want to get caught in the rain. She picked up her pace, mentally calculating bus times and dinner options. There was leftover pasta from Sunday, and she needed to study for tomorrow's quiz. She was so focused on her mental checklist that she almost missed it, the unusual sight that would change everything. But something made her look up, made her notice what others were hurrying past. There, on the corner of Marshall and Pine, stood an elderly gentleman in expensive clothes, looking completely lost. Sarah slowed her steps. The man turned in a circle, his confusion evident in every movement. His beige cashmere sweater probably cost more than her monthly bus passes, but his eyes held a fear that made him look small and vulnerable. She should keep walking. She was tired, and the clouds threatened rain. But her feet had already stopped, and she found herself taking a step toward him. That's when she noticed the other man watching from across the street, his eyes fixed on the elderly gentleman's gold watch. Sarah took a deep breath. She was going to miss her bus. "Excuse me, sir," she said, approaching carefully. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The elderly man turned to Sarah, his eyes brightening with relief. "Oh, yes, I seem to be." He paused, looking around in confusion. "I can't quite remember where I'm going." Sarah glanced across the street. The suspicious man had moved closer, pretending to check his phone. Her heart beat faster. "I'm Sarah," she said, keeping her voice calm. "What's your name, sir?" "James. James Harrison." He straightened his shoulders, some dignity returning to his posture. "I was taking my afternoon walk, but everything looks different." A group of executives rushed past them, briefcases swinging. One man's shoulder bumped Mr. Harrison, making him stumble. Sarah steadied him with a hand on his arm. "Excuse me," she called to the executives. "Could you help us? This gentleman is lost." They didn't even slow down. One woman glanced back briefly, then hurried on. "Perhaps I should sit down," Mr. Harrison said, his voice shaking slightly. "There used to be a bench here. I remember a bench." Sarah looked around. The nearest bench was 2 blocks away, in front of the convenience store. The suspicious man had crossed to their side of the street now, still maintaining his distance but definitely watching. "Sir, do you have a phone? We could call someone to pick you up." Mr. Harrison patted his pockets with trembling hands. I thought I brought it. Martha always reminds me." His face fell. "But Martha's not. She's gone now." Thunder rumbled overhead. Sarah felt the first drop of rain hit her cheek. She needed to make a decision. "Mr. Harrison, do you remember your address? Where you live?" He brightened again. Yes, I do. It's 1242, Oakwood Drive. The white house with green shutters." Martha picked the color. His smile faded. "But I don't recognize these streets." Sarah knew Oakwood Drive. It was in the wealthy part of town, at least 30 minutes' walk from here, in the opposite direction from her apartment. Another raindrop fell. Then another. The suspicious man had moved closer, now only half a block away. "Don't worry, Mr. Harrison. I know where Oakwood Drive is. I can help you get home." His eyes filled with tears. "You're very kind, but I couldn't impose. A young lady like you must have somewhere to be." Sarah adjusted her backpack. "It's no trouble. Really?" The rain was falling steadily now. Sarah took off her coffee shop jacket and held it over Mr. Harrison's head. His sweater looked expensive, probably dry clean only. "Such a kind girl," he murmured. "Like my students used to be. Before I retired." They started walking, Sarah guiding them toward Oakwood Drive. The suspicious man finally gave up, disappearing down a side street. "You were a teacher?" Sarah asked, trying to keep him talking. "Professor. At the university. Literature." He spoke in fragments, concentrating on his steps. "Taught for 40 years. The Romantics were my specialty. Wordsworth. Coleridge. A car splashed past, sending dirty water onto the sidewalk. Sarah steered Mr. Harrison away from the curb. I love reading, she said. Especially the classics. Do you? His face lit up. What's your favorite? Jane Austen. Pride and Prejudice. Ah, Elizabeth Bennet. A woman ahead of her time. He quoted. Till this moment I never knew myself. They walked slowly, Sarah matching her pace to his. The rain fell harder. Her coffee shop jacket wasn't doing much to keep either of them dry anymore. My son tells me I shouldn't walk alone, Mr. Harrison said suddenly. Says it's not safe anymore. But I've been walking these streets for 50 years. Is your son nearby? We could call him. Mr. Harrison's face clouded. He's very busy. Important meetings. I don't like to bother him. They passed from Sarah's neighborhood into the next, the buildings growing nicer, the sidewalks better maintained. Her wet shoes squeaked with every step. I should remember this, Mr. Harrison said, looking around. It all looks familiar and strange at the same time. Like a photograph that's slightly out of focus. Sarah checked her phone. Her mom had texted, "Hope you're somewhere dry. Storm's getting worse." She texted back, "Helping someone. Be home little later." "Don't worry. You must think I'm very foolish," Mr. Harrison said. "An old man who can't find his way home." "No, so not foolish at all." They waited at a crosswalk. Mr. Harrison's hands were shaking again, but his eyes were clearer now. "I have moments," he said quietly, "when everything gets confused. The doctors call it early-stage Alzheimer's. Some days are better than others." Sarah thought of her grandmother, who had lived with them until she passed 2 years ago. The way she would sometimes wake up at night, confused about where she was. "My grandmother used to say that getting lost isn't so bad if someone helps you find your way back." Mr. Harrison smiled. "Your grandmother sounds wise." They turned onto Cedar Street. The houses here were large, set back from the road behind manicured lawns. The rain had eased to a drizzle. "Almost there," Sarah said. "Oakwood Drive is just ahead." Yes, I know this street. The Andersons live there, with their yapping dog." His step quickened. "And that's the Miller's house, with the red door." They turned onto Oakwood Drive. The houses here were even larger, with circular driveways and 3-car garages. "There," Mr. Harrison pointed. "The white house with green shutters. That's my home." Sarah's wet shoes squished on the perfect lawn as they walked up the driveway. Before they reached the door, it flew open. "Mr. Harrison." A woman in a housekeeper's uniform rushed out. "Oh, thank God. I was about to call the police." "Maria," he smiled. "I got a bit turned around, but this kind young lady helped me." Maria grabbed Sarah's hands. Thank you. We've been so worried." He usually comes back from his walk by 4. "And with this rain, it's no problem," Sarah said, suddenly aware of how wet and bedraggled she must look, standing on this pristine porch. "Please, come in," Maria said. "Let me get you a towel, some hot tea." Sarah glanced at her phone. Almost 6 o'clock. Her mom would be wondering where she was. "I should get going. Got homework to do." "At least let me call you a car," Maria insisted. "Or give you some money for the bus." "Really? It's okay. I don't mind walking." Mr. Harrison had been quiet, but now he spoke up. "Your name?" "Sarah." "Yes? Would you leave your phone number? In case I need help again." Sarah hesitated, then nodded. Maria brought her a piece of paper and a pen. She wrote down her name and the coffee shop's number. "Thank you, Sarah," Mr. Harrison said formally. "You're a rare kind of person in today's world." The rain had stopped completely now. The setting sun broke through the clouds, turning puddles into mirrors. Sarah started her long walk home, her wet clothes heavy, her feet aching. But somehow, she didn't feel tired anymore. Behind her, the white house with green shutters glowed in the evening light, and she could still see Mr. Harrison standing in the doorway, watching her go. Sarah collapsed onto her bed, still in her damp clothes. Her phone showed 3 missed calls from her mom. She pressed dial. "Sarah Thompson, where are you?" Her mother's voice was tight with worry. "I'm home now, Mom. Sorry I'm late." "You better have a good explanation, young lady." Sarah sat up, peeling off her wet socks. "I helped an old man get home. He was lost. He has Alzheimer's." A pause. "Like Grandma?" "Yeah. He couldn't remember how to get back. And there was this sketchy guy watching him." Her mother sighed. You know how dangerous that could have been? Getting involved with strangers. I know, but... Sarah thought of Mr. Harrison's confused eyes. I couldn't just leave him there. No, I suppose you couldn't. Her mother's voice softened. Just like I can't leave my patients when they need me. You're too much like me sometimes. After hanging up, Sarah showered and changed into dry clothes. She tried to focus on her homework, but her mind kept drifting back to the White House with green shutters. The next morning at the coffee shop, Jenny noticed her distraction. You're overthinking something, Jenny said, watching Sarah wipe the same spot on the counter for the third time. Spill. Sarah told her about Mr. Harrison. I keep wondering if he's okay today. Girl, you did your good deed. Let it go. The morning rush kept her busy, but during her break, Sarah found herself looking up Alzheimer's disease on her phone. The symptoms, the progression, the way it affected families. Around noon, the shop door chimed. Sarah looked up from the espresso machine and froze. A man in an expensive suit stood at the counter, his tie perfectly knotted, his shoes gleaming. He looked around 40, with graying temples and his father's sharp jawline. Are you Sarah? He asked. She nodded, wiping her hands on her apron. I'm Richard Harrison, James Harrison's son. Jenny appeared beside Sarah. Take your break early, she said quietly. Sarah led Richard Harrison to a corner table. He sat down, placing his leather briefcase carefully beside him. My father told me what you did yesterday, he said, during one of his lucid moments this morning. Is he okay? Yes, thanks to you. He studied her face. The housekeeper said you refused any payment. I didn't help him for money. No, I can see that. He leaned back. Tell me about yourself, Sarah. She shifted in her chair. Not much to tell. I work here part-time. Go to school. Help my mom with bills. And college plans. Applying now. Hoping for scholarships. Richard Harrison nodded slowly. My father was a professor at Riverside University for 40 years. Did he mention that? He said something about teaching literature. He was department chair for 20 years. Still has connections there. He pulled out a business card. If you ever need a recommendation letter. Sarah stared at the card. Riverside University was her dream school, but the tuition was way out of reach. That's very generous, but no strings attached, he said. Just, would you consider visiting him sometimes? He seems lighter today, talking about your conversation. It's been a while since I've seen him like that. Sarah thought about her packed schedule, school, work, studying. But she also thought about Mr. Harrison quoting Pride and Prejudice in the rain. I'd like that, she said. Richard Harrison stood up. I'll have Maria call you to set up a time. He hesitated. Thank you, Sarah. Not just for getting him home safely, but for treating him like a person. Not everyone does, since the diagnosis. After he left, Jenny cornered her. Was that who I think it was? Richard Harrison, the real estate developer. Sarah looked at the business card in her hand. I guess so. Girl, do you know how loaded that family is? The Harrisons practically built this city. The rest of Sarah's shift passed in a blur. When she got home that evening, her mother was already there, heating up leftovers. You're early, Sarah said, surprised. Switched shifts with Karen. Her mother pulled out another plate. Thought we could have dinner together for once. Tell me more about this Mr. Harrison you helped. Over dinner, Sarah told her everything. The walk home, Richard Harrison's visit, the offer to help with college. Sounds too good to be true, her mother said cautiously. Maybe. But Mom, you should have seen Mr. Harrison yesterday. He reminded me so much of Grandma. Remember how scared she'd get when things stopped making sense? Her mother was quiet for a moment. Your grandma was lucky to have us. Sounds like Mr. Harrison could use someone in his corner too. The next day after school, Sarah's phone rang. It was Maria, Mr. Harrison's housekeeper. Mr. Harrison asked if you might visit this afternoon, Maria said. He's having a good day today. Sarah looked at her backpack full of homework. What time? An hour later, she stood again on the pristine porch of the White House. Maria opened the door before she could knock. He's in the library, Maria said, leading her through the house. Sarah tried not to stare at the oil paintings on the walls, the antique furniture, the gleaming hardwood floors. The library was a large room lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. Mr. Harrison sat in a leather armchair by the window, reading. He looked up as she entered, his face brightening. Sarah, I was hoping you'd come. How are you feeling today, Mr. Harrison? Much better. Much clearer. He gestured to the shelves. Do you really enjoy reading classics? Sarah nodded. Then please, look around. Any book that catches your eye, it's yours. Sarah's fingers trailed along the spines. First editions. Leather-bound collections. Books she'd only read about. These are too valuable. Books are meant to be read, Mr. Harrison said firmly. Not just displayed. He smiled. Tell me, what did you think of Elizabeth Bennet's prejudices? They talked about literature for over an hour. Mr. Harrison's knowledge was vast, but he listened to her opinions with genuine interest. Sometimes he would pause, struggling to remember a detail, but Sarah learned to wait patiently through these moments. You would have made an excellent student, he said finally. The kind that makes teaching worthwhile. Sarah glanced at her phone. I should go. Got a history test tomorrow. Take a book, he insisted. Please. She chose a worn copy of Jane Eyre. Mr. Harrison nodded approvingly. Come again, he asked as Maria showed her out. The books will be here. And it's nice, having someone to discuss them with. On the bus ride home, Sarah opened the book. Inside the cover, in faded ink, was an inscription. To my beloved James, may these pages bring you the same joy they brought me. All my love, Martha. Sarah closed the book carefully. She thought about love that lasted 40 years, about sons too busy to visit, about the way knowledge and memories could slip away like water through cupped hands. She thought about choices and consequences, and the strange paths that led people into each other's lives. The bus turned onto her street as the sun set, painting the sky in colors that would have made Wordsworth himself struggle for words. Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in bed. Mr. Harrison's copy of Jane Eyre opened beside her. Martha's handwriting kept drawing her eyes, elegant loops that spoke of a different era. The bedside clock showed 2:47 a.m. Her phone buzzed. A text from Jenny. You'll never believe who came back to the shop after you left. Sarah sat up. Oh, Richard Harrison. Asked questions about you. Your schedule? How long you've worked here? Sarah's fingers hovered over the keyboard. What did you tell him? The truth. That you're our best worker. That you study during every break. That you've never been late. Not once. Sarah stared at the message. Why would he want to know all that? Girl, don't be dense. He's obviously checking you out. Making sure you're not trying to scam his dad. The thought hadn't occurred to Sarah. She looked at the book again, at Martha's careful inscription. I would never. I know that. And after today, he probably knows it too. Sarah finally fell asleep around 4, only to jerk awake at 4:30 when her alarm went off. The morning felt heavy, like moving through water. You look terrible, her mother said, accepting her coffee. Thanks, Mom. Love you too. I mean it. You're pushing yourself too hard. Sarah shrugged. Just couldn't sleep. The morning rush at the coffee shop was brutal. Sarah mixed up 2 orders and nearly burned herself on the espresso machine. Jenny kept shooting her concerned looks. Go take 10, Jenny said finally. Before you hurt yourself. Sarah slumped in the break room, pulling out Jane Eyre. She'd read it before, but this copy was different. Notes in the margins caught her eye. Some in Martha's elegant script, others in a firmer hand she recognized as Mr. Harrison's. The bell above the shop door chimed. Sarah heard Jenny's sharp intake of breath. Good morning, a familiar voice said. Is Sarah working today? Sarah stood up so quickly she knocked over her chair. Through the break room window, she saw Richard Harrison at the counter. But he wasn't alone. Mr. Harrison stood beside him, looking more alert than she'd ever seen him. Sarah, Mr. Harrison called out when he saw her. I remembered you worked here. Told Richard we had to come. She hurried out. Mr. Harrison, how are you? Better today. Much better. He looked around the coffee shop with interest. So this is where you make all that excellent coffee Maria told me about. Can I get you something? On the house. Nonsense, Richard said. We'll pay like any other customer. Jenny appeared with a notepad. What can I get you, gentlemen? Medium dark roast. Richard ordered. Father. Mr. Harrison studied the menu board. What do you recommend, Sarah? Our house blend is good. Oh. She hesitated. We have this new vanilla lavender latte. It's subtle, not too sweet. Lavender? His eyes lit up. Martha used to grow lavender in our garden. Said it helped her think clearly. He turned to his son. Did I tell you about Martha's garden? Yes, father. Many times. Then I'll have the lavender latte, Mr. Harrison said firmly. Sarah started making their drinks. Behind her, she could hear Mr. Harrison telling Richard about Martha's garden, about the summers they spent reading outside, about the bees that would visit the lavender bushes. Here you go. She handed them their drinks. Careful, they are hot. Mr. Harrison took a sip of his latte. His eyes closed, just like summer evenings in the garden. Richard checked his watch. Father, we should go. You have a doctor's appointment at 11. Always rushing, Mr. Harrison muttered. Just like when you were a boy. Never time to stop and smell the lavender. Richard's face tightened. The doctor's waiting. It's fine, Mr. Harrison said to Sarah. He means well. Just forgot how to slow down somewhere along the way. He took another sip of latte. Will you visit again soon? I found some books I think you'd enjoy. Of course. After they left, Jenny whistled low. Well, that was interesting. What do you mean? The way he lights up around you. Like you remind him of someone. Sarah thought about Martha's handwriting, about lavender in a summer garden. Maybe I do. The rest of her shift passed slowly. She kept thinking about Mr. Harrison's words, about Richard forgetting how to slow down, about time rushing past like water. When she got home that evening, her mother was watching TV on their old couch. Got something to tell you, her mother said. Richard Harrison called the hospital today. Sarah froze. What? Why? Wanted to know about my shifts. Said he might be able to help arrange my schedule so I could spend more time with you. Mom, I'm so sorry. I never meant dash. Let me finish. Her mother muted the TV. He also asked about our situation. About how we've managed since your father left. About how you've stepped up to help. Sarah sat down heavily. What did you tell him? The truth. That you've worked harder than any teenager should have to. That you never complain. That you still find time to help others, even with everything on your plate. Sarah stared at her hands. I don't want them thinking we need charity. Is that what you think this is? Charity? Her mother shook her head. Baby, sometimes people recognize something special in others. Sometimes they want to help not because they pity you, but because they see your worth. But dash, Mr. Harrison was a professor for 40 years. You think he can't spot a promising student? And his son's a businessman. You think he can't recognize a solid investment when he sees one? Sarah pulled out Jane Eyre, showed her mother the inscription. Martha's handwriting, she said. She loved books too. Maybe that's why Mr. Harrison sees something familiar in you. Her mother smiled. Could be. Love leaves echoes, baby. Sometimes they bounce back to us in unexpected ways. Sarah's phone buzzed. A text from Maria. Mr. Harrison asked if you could visit tomorrow. Says he has something important to show you. Go, her mother said, reading over her shoulder. Whatever's happening here, it's bigger than charity. Trust me on this. That night, Sarah dreamed of lavender fields stretching to the horizon. In the dream, she was reading aloud from Jane Eyre, and somewhere nearby, Martha was tending her garden, humming softly in the summer air. She woke up feeling more rested than she had in days, despite getting only 5 hours of sleep. The morning light seemed different somehow, like it was touching everything with gold. Her mother was already up, making coffee. I got this, Sarah said, reaching for the pot. No. Her mother gently pushed her toward the table. Let me, just for today. You've been carrying so much for so long. Time to let others help carry it too. The coffee, when it came, wasn't quite as good as Sarah's. But somehow, it tasted perfect anyway. The Harrison mansion looked different in morning light. Sarah stood at the front door, her backpack heavy with homework she'd need to do later. Maria opened the door before she could knock. They're in the study, she said. Mr. Richard is here too. Sarah followed Maria down the hallway. Through an open door, she saw Richard Harrison standing by a window, phone to his ear. He held up one finger in a wait gesture. Yes, I understand the property value. But, he turned away, voice dropping. We can discuss this later. Mr. Harrison sat in his usual leather chair, a stack of books beside him. Sarah, good morning. Did you finish Jane Eyre? Almost. The margins are fascinating. Ah, Martha's notes. He smiled. She taught high school English. Always analyzing. That woman. Richard ended his call. Sorry about that. Business never sleeps. Unlike some of us, Mr. Harrison said dryly. Sarah, would you make some coffee? Maria showed you where everything is last time. In the kitchen, Sarah found the expensive coffee maker. Different from the commercial ones at work, but the principles were the same. She measured beans into the grinder. Richard followed her. We need to talk. Sarah's hand stilled on the grinder. About what? Your future. He leaned against the counter. I've been asking around about you. I know. Then you know I'm aware of your situation. Single mother. Part-time job. Scholarship hopes. He watched her measure coffee into the filter. My father says you want to attend Riverside. It's probably just a dream. Why? Sarah laughed shortly. Have you seen the tuition? I've seen your grades. Heard about your work ethic. That's worth more than tuition. The coffee maker hummed to life. Sarah kept her eyes on it. Mr. Harrison, I appreciate what you're trying to do. But Richard, he interrupted. Call me Richard. And I'm not trying to do anything except right by my father. She turned to face him. What does that mean? It means I haven't seen him this engaged in years. Since before Mother died. Richard ran a hand through his hair. I've been busy. Building the business, managing properties, making deals. I told myself it was all for him, for the family legacy. But somewhere along the way, you forgot to slow down and smell the lavender. He smiled slightly. He told you about Mother's garden. A little. It was her pride and joy. After she died, Father let it go. Said he couldn't bear to see it without her there. Richard stared out the kitchen window. I should have noticed then how much he was withdrawing. But I was always rushing to the next meeting, the next deal. The coffee finished brewing. Sarah poured 3 cups. I'm not looking for charity, she said firmly. Good. Because I'm not offering any. Richard picked up his cup. I'm offering an investment. In you, in your education. Because you've given my father something I couldn't. Time, attention, respect. He makes it easy. He knows so much about literature, about life. When he remembers. Richard's voice turned bitter. The doctors say it will get worse. The confused episodes will get longer, more frequent. Eventually. But he's here now, Sarah said quietly. That's what matters. Richard studied her over his coffee cup. You really believe that, don't you? My grandmother had Alzheimer's. Sometimes she didn't know where she was, or who we were. But she was still herself. Still loved us, even when she couldn't remember why. They carried the coffee back to the study. Mr. Harrison had spread several books on a small table. There you are, Sarah. Look what I found. He held up a leather-bound volume. First edition Wordsworth. Martha used to read this to me in the garden. Sarah set his coffee down carefully away from the books. Would you read some to us? Mr. Harrison opened the book with practiced care. Ah, here's a good one. I wandered lonely as a cloud. His voice filled the study, strong and clear. Sarah watched Richard sink into a chair, his ever-present phone forgotten in his pocket. For half an hour, they sat in the morning light while Mr. Harrison read poem after poem. Sometimes he stumbled over words, and Sarah would quietly help him find his place again. Sometimes he'd stop to explain the meaning behind certain lines, his professor's instincts surfacing. Richard's phone buzzed. He pulled it out, then hesitated. Let it go to voicemail, Mr. Harrison said, not looking up from his book. The world won't end if you're unavailable for an hour. Slowly, Richard put the phone away. Sarah, Mr. Harrison said suddenly, would you like to see Martha's garden? Richard tensed. Father, it hasn't been maintained. All the more reason to show her. Maybe she'll see what it could be again. They followed Mr. Harrison through French doors onto a stone patio. Beyond it stretched what must once have been a magnificent garden. Now overgrown, tangled, but Sarah could see the bones of it. The planned paths, the careful layouts. The lavender was here, Mr. Harrison said, pointing. And roses there, along that wall. Martha knew every plant, every flower's meaning. It could be beautiful again, Sarah said. Yes. Mr. Harrison touched a weathered bench. Martha would sit here, grading papers. I'd read to her while she worked. He turned to Richard. You used to play here, remember? Running through the paths, hiding behind the bushes. Richard's face softened. I remember. Mother would pretend she couldn't find me. We could fix it, Sarah said. Clear the weeds, replant the lavender. I could help, between work and school. You do that. Mr. Harrison's eyes filled with tears. We all could, Richard said quietly. I could come on weekends, when there aren't any meetings. Mr. Harrison sat on the bench, patting the space beside him. Tell me, Sarah, what are your dreams? Besides Riverside? I want to teach, she said. Like you did. Help people discover what books can show them about life, about themselves. A noble goal. He took her hand. Richard, do you still have connections at the university? Yes, Father. Good. Because I think we found our next scholarship candidate. He squeezed Sarah's hand. No arguments, my dear. Consider it payment for helping restore Martha's garden. Sarah looked at the overgrown space, imagining it full of life again. Imagining Mr. Harrison sitting on this bench while she read to him, the scent of lavender in the air. Okay, she said, but I'm still making your coffee. Richard laughed. I think that can be arranged. He pulled out his phone, then put it away again. Actually, the emails can wait. Father, tell us more about Mother's roses. They sat in the wild garden until lunchtime, listening to Mr. Harrison's stories, planning what could be rebuilt, what could be saved. A family of birds had made a nest in an old trellis. Like the garden, Sarah thought, life finds a way to bloom even in forgotten places. When she left that afternoon, both Harrison men walked her to the door. Same time next week, Mr. Harrison asked. We can start on the garden. I'll bring gloves, Sarah promised. And I'll be here, Richard said. No meetings. Sarah smiled all the way home, already planning where the new lavender should go. Sarah's alarm went off at 4:30 a.m. as usual, but she was already awake. She'd spent half the night researching garden restoration, learning about soil types and pruning techniques. Her phone was full of bookmark pages about lavender cultivation. Her mother stood in the kitchen doorway, watching her make coffee. You're humming. Am I? Haven't heard you do that since. Well, since before your father left. Sarah poured 2 cups. I'm excited about today. We're starting work on Mrs. Harrison's garden. We? Her mother raised an eyebrow. Mr. Harrison, Richard, and me. Richard's actually taking a whole Saturday off work. Must be serious then. Her mother sipped her coffee. You know, I switched shifts again. Thought I might come see this garden everyone's talking about. Sarah nearly dropped her cup. Really? If that's okay. Richard Harrison called again. Invited me to lunch there. Mom, that would be amazing. The morning at the coffee shop crawled by. Jenny noticed Sarah checking the clock every 5 minutes. Hot date, she teased. Garden work, actually. Only you would be this excited about pulling weeds. Finally, her shift ended. Sarah rushed home to change. Then she and her mother took the bus to the Harrison house. Sarah bounced her leg the whole way. Nervous, her mother asked, What if they don't like you? What if you don't like them? Baby, they already like me. They like what I raised. She squeezed Sarah's hand. And I already like them for seeing what I've always seen in you. Maria met them at the door, wearing jeans instead of her usual uniform. Everyone's out back. Mr. Harrison's been up since dawn, making plans. They found the Harrison men in the garden. Richard wore dress shoes with his work clothes, looking slightly lost with a pair of gardening shears. Mr. Harrison sat on his bench, surrounded by sketches of the garden's original layout. Sarah, Mr. Harrison called out. And this must be your mother. Come. I've been telling Richard about Martha's rose archways. Sarah's mother stepped forward. I'm Linda Thompson. Thank you for inviting me. The pleasure's ours, Richard said, setting down the shears. Your daughter has been revolutionary for this family. They all looked at the overgrown garden. Sunlight filtered through tangled branches, showing hints of the beauty that once was. Where do we start? Sarah asked. Clearing paths, Richard said, so we can access the whole space. They worked through the morning. Sarah and her mother tackled the weeds while Richard struggled with overgrown branches. Mr. Harrison directed from his bench, his memory surprisingly sharp about the garden's original design. The bird bath was there, he'd call out, and Martha's favorite roses grew along that wall. Around noon, Maria brought out sandwiches and lemonade. They sat on blankets in a newly cleared patch, dirt under their fingernails, sweat on their faces. Linda, Mr. Harrison said, tell me about Sarah as a child. Was she always so drawn to books? Sarah's mother laughed. From the moment she could read. Used to get in trouble at school for reading under her desk during math. Mom, what? It's true. She turned to Richard. Her third-grade teacher called me in because Sarah was reading Shakespeare instead of doing multiplication tables. Shakespeare in third grade. Richard looked impressed. I didn't understand most of it, Sarah admitted, but I liked the way the words sounded. Just like Martha, Mr. Harrison said softly. She used to read poetry to her students, said the rhythm helped them remember the meanings. They worked until the sun began to set. The garden looked different now, still wild, but with purpose showing through. They'd uncovered old stepping stones, cleared the central paths, found the skeleton of a rose trellis beneath the overgrowth. Next week, Richard said, I'll bring proper tools. Maybe hire some help for the heavy lifting. No, Mr. Harrison said firmly. We do this ourselves. As a family. The word hung in the air. Sarah felt her mother stiffen beside her. I didn't mean. Mr. Harrison began. It's okay, Sarah's mother said. I understand what you meant. Family isn't always about blood. Richard cleared his throat. Linda, could we talk privately for a moment? They walked toward the house, leaving Sarah and Mr. Harrison by the bench. Did I overstep? He asked anxiously. Sometimes I say things without thinking. No, Sarah said. You didn't overstep. Inside the house, Richard and Linda stood in the kitchen. Maria busied herself loading the dishwasher, pretending not to listen. I want to be clear about something, Richard said. This isn't charity. I know. Linda crossed her arms. My daughter wouldn't accept charity. No, she wouldn't. But she would accept an opportunity to help others while helping herself. He pulled out an envelope. This is the recommendation letter for Riverside. I'd like you to read it before I send it. Linda opened the envelope, read in silence. Well, Richard asked. It's perfect. Everything I've always known about her, but could never put into words. Father helped write it. On one of his good days. Richard looked out the window at Sarah and his father, heads bent together over a garden plan. She gave him purpose again. Let him be a teacher one more time. And what did he give her? Besides a shot at her dreams. Richard smiled. He gave her what I forgot to give him. Time, attention, respect. Linda folded the letter carefully. Your mother's garden, it was special to them. It was their place. Where they read, talked, grew things together. He touched the window glass. After she died, he couldn't bear to be there. Said it hurt too much, seeing it empty. But now he has someone to share it with again. Richard turned to face her. Linda, I've made mistakes with my father. Put business before family too many times. Sarah helped me see that. She has that effect on people, Linda said softly. Makes them see what really matters. Outside, the sunset painted the garden gold. Sarah and Mr. Harrison had moved to the bench, a book open between them. I think, Richard said, we all needed this garden restored. Not just the plants, but what it represents. Connection. Growth. New life from old roots. Linda watched her daughter point something out in the book. Watched Mr. Harrison nod and smile. Yes, she said. I think you're right. They walked back outside. Mr. Harrison looked up from the book. Linda, he called out, come listen to this passage. It reminds me of Martha's roses. As the light faded, they sat in the half-restored garden, listening to words written long ago about beauty and growth and the way love transforms common things into magic. Above them, the birds nested in the old trellis chirped their evening songs. Soon, Sarah thought, roses would climb there again. Soon, lavender would scent the air. Soon, this space would be full of life and memory and future, all growing together. Same time next Saturday, Richard asked as they prepared to leave. Sarah looked at her mother, who nodded. Same time, Sarah said, we have a garden to rebuild. Richard Harrison sat at his father's desk, staring at the blank document on his laptop. The recommendation letter for Sarah needed to be perfect. Through the study window, he could see his father sitting in the restored section of the garden, reading. He typed, to the admissions committee of Riverside University, then stopped. How do you capture someone's essence in words? How do you explain that a 17-year-old girl had brought life back to a grieving house? A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Maria entered with coffee. She's here, Maria said. In the garden with your father. Richard stood and walked to the window. Sarah was kneeling by the newly planted lavender, checking the soil. His father was showing her something in a gardening book. I need to write this letter, he said. Then write what you see, Maria replied simply. Richard sat back down and began to type. Outside, Sarah brushed dirt from her jeans. The lavender's taking well, Mr. Harrison. The roots look strong. Just like you, he said. Strong roots, ready to bloom. Did you always talk to your students in metaphors? Only the ones who understood them. He closed the gardening book. Richard's writing your letter today. Sarah's hands stilled on the lavender. I've been trying not to think about it. Nervous. Terrified. She sat on the bench beside him. What if Riverside says no? Then we try somewhere else. He patted her hand. But they won't say no. How can you be so sure? Because I taught there for 40 years. I know what they look for. He smiled. And I helped Richard with a letter. Inside, Richard was still typing. In my 20 years of business, I have rarely encountered someone with such a perfect balance of intelligence and compassion. Sarah Thompson doesn't just see opportunities. She sees people. She doesn't just work hard. She works with purpose. His phone buzzed. Another business call. He silenced it. The words flowed faster now. When my father was diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's, I thought I was doing everything right. I hired the best caregivers, consulted the best doctors, managed his finances. What I failed to do was give him what he needed most: time, understanding, and dignity. Sarah Thompson provided all three, not because she had to, but because that's who she is. She saw not an old man with a failing memory, but a professor with a lifetime of knowledge to share. She saw not a neglected garden, but a space where memories could bloom again. In the garden, Sarah and Mr. Harrison had moved to the rose trellis. The first buds were appearing on the carefully pruned canes. Martha would have liked you, Mr. Harrison said suddenly. Tell me about her. The real her, not just the garden and the books. She was direct. No patience for pretense. When I'd get too caught up in academic theory, she'd say, James Harrison, people aren't footnotes. They are stories. He touched a rosebud gently. She would have seen right through all this. Or what? The way Richard thinks he needs to make up for lost time. The way I pretend not to notice my bad days getting worse. He turned to Sarah. The way you try to carry everyone else's burdens. Sarah looked down at her dirt-stained hands. Martha would have said we're all works in progress, Mr. Harrison continued. All growing at our own pace, in our own way. Richard's fingers moved across the keyboard. Sarah works part-time at a coffee shop, maintains excellent grades, helps care for her single mother, and still finds time to visit my father 3 times a week. She's helped restore not just my mother's garden, but my father's sense of purpose. She's reminded me of what truly matters in life. But perhaps most importantly, she's shown me what real investment looks like. Not in stocks or properties, but in people, in relationships, in the kind of growth that can't be measured in quarterly reports. Sarah's phone buzzed. A text from Jenny. When are you coming back to work? Customers keep asking about you. I should go, she said to Mr. Harrison. Got a shift tomorrow morning. Before you do. He pulled an envelope from his book. I wrote something too, for Richard to include in the letter. Sarah took the envelope with trembling hands. Don't read it now, he said. Wait until you're home. Richard was finishing the letter. I am not just recommending Sarah Thompson for admission to Riverside University. I am telling you, with complete conviction, that she will make your institution better by her presence. She will bring to your campus what she brought to our family: intelligence tempered by empathy, ambition guided by compassion, and the rare ability to see the best in people even when they've forgotten it themselves. My father, Professor James Harrison, was a fixture at Riverside for 40 years. He taught countless students about literature, about critical thinking, about the power of words. But in these past months, as his own words sometimes fail him, he has found in Sarah Thompson a student who teaches as much as she learns. I am attaching his personal note about Sarah, written on one of his clear days. His words carry more weight than mine ever could. Richard saved the document and walked to the garden. Sarah was leaving, hugging his father goodbye. The letter? Mr. Harrison asked after she'd gone. Almost done. Just need to add your note. Richard sat on the bench. What did you write? The truth. Mr. Harrison smiled. That some people are books waiting to be read, and some are gardens waiting to bloom. But Sarah Thompson is both, and more. That evening, Sarah sat on her bed and opened Mr. Harrison's envelope. Her mother found her there an hour later, tears running down her face. Baby, What's wrong? Sarah handed her the letter. Linda read it slowly, then pulled her daughter close. He's right. You know, Linda said. About all of it. I don't want to leave him, Sarah whispered. What if he forgets me? Oh, baby. Linda stroked her hair. Some things the heart remembers even when the mind forgets. Your grandmother might not have known my name near the end, but she always smiled when I walked in. Love leaves marks that even Alzheimer's can't erase. The next morning, Sarah made coffee as usual. But this time, she took a picture of the sunrise through their kitchen window. Later, she'd show it to Mr. Harrison, tell him how the colors reminded her of his roses. Some things were changing, college applications, recommendation letters, futures taking shape. But other things stayed constant. Morning coffee, garden work, book shared between friends. Sarah touched the letter in her pocket. Mr. Harrison had written, "To the committee, you're not just accepting a student. You're accepting a gardener of minds, a keeper of stories, a young woman who knows that education, like a garden, is about nurturing growth in others. Don't let this one get away." The morning light caught the coffee steam, making it dance. Sarah thought about roots and blooms, about words and memories, about the way love grows in unexpected places. She poured 2 cups of coffee and went to wake her mother. The envelope from Riverside University sat on the kitchen table. Sarah stared at it, hands wrapped around her coffee mug. Too thin to be a rejection, too thick to be just a form letter. "Open it," her mother urged. "I can't." Sarah pushed it away. "You do it." Linda picked up the envelope. "You sure?" Sarah nodded, unable to speak. Her mother's fingers broke the seal carefully, pulled out the papers inside. Sarah watched her mother's face, looking for any sign. Linda's eyes widened. Her hand went to her mouth. "Mom!" "Full scholarship," Linda whispered, "including housing and books." The mug slipped from Sarah's hands, coffee splashing across the table. Neither of them moved to clean it up. "Read it again," Sarah said. Linda's voice shook. "Dear Ms. Thompson, we are pleased to offer you admission to Riverside University's class of 2029 with a full academic scholarship." Sarah grabbed her phone, hands trembling. She had to tell them, had to share this moment. But when she called the Harrison house, Maria answered in a whisper. "It's not a good day, Sarah. Mr. Harrison, he's very confused. Keeps asking for Martha." Sarah's joy deflated. "Should I come over?" "Maybe later. The doctor's here now." Richard called an hour later, while Sarah was mopping up the spilled coffee. "Father's sleeping," he said. "The medication helps, but he was asking for you earlier." In one of his clearer moments, said something about needing to check the lavender. "I got into Riverside," Sarah blurted out. "Full scholarship." A pause. Then, "Of course you did. Hold on. I'm coming to pick you up. Father needs to hear this news in person. Good day or bad." 30 minutes later, Richard's car pulled up outside their apartment. Sarah and her mother climbed in, the acceptance letter clutched in Sarah's hand. "He's having more bad days," Richard said as he drove. "But he still knows you. Still lights up when you visit." The Harrison house was quiet when they arrived. Maria met them at the door. "He's in the garden," she said. "More aware now. The doctor said to let him do familiar things." They found Mr. Harrison by the lavender bed, hands in the soil. He looked up as they approached. "Sarah." His face brightened. "I was just thinking, the lavender needs checking. Martha always said." "I'm here to help," Sarah said quickly. "Let's check it together." She knelt beside him, showing him the healthy plants. Slowly, his movements became more focused, more present. "You seem happy today," he said suddenly. "Something's different." Sarah pulled out the letter. "I got into Riverside." He stared at her, then at the letter. For a moment, confusion clouded his eyes. "Riverside? I taught there. 40 years. His hand shook as he touched the university seal. "Martha said." "What did Martha say about Riverside?" "That it's where you two met," Richard said gently. "In the university library." Yes, she was studying English literature. Dropped her books right in front of my desk." The memory seemed to ground him. He focused on Sarah again. "You'll study literature too?" "Yes, so thanks to your recommendation." "My recommendation?" He frowned. "Father, you wrote her a beautiful letter," Richard reminded him. "Remember? About gardeners of minds." Mr. Harrison closed his eyes. Sarah's heart sank. But then he spoke, his voice stronger. To the committee, you're not just accepting a student. You're accepting a gardener of minds. A keeper of stories, Sarah continued softly. A young woman who knows that education, like a garden, is about nurturing growth in others. He opened his eyes, fully present now. I remember writing that. He pulled Sarah into a fierce hug. Over his shoulder, she saw Richard wipe his eyes. We should celebrate, Linda said. I brought ingredients for lunch. Maria, will you help me in the kitchen? They left Sarah with the Harrison men in the garden. Mr. Harrison insisted on checking every plant, telling stories about each one. Martha planted these roses on our 10th anniversary, he said, touching a bloom. Said they'd grow old with us. He looked at Sarah. You'll plant something before you go? Leave your mark in the garden. Of course. Maybe by the bird bath, Richard suggested. That space needs something new. They spent the afternoon in the garden. Linda and Maria brought out sandwiches and lemonade. Mr. Harrison had a few confused moments, but Sarah learned to guide him back gently, using the plants and books as anchors. You'll visit? He asked suddenly. When you're at school? Every weekend, Sarah promised. Someone has to help tend the garden. And check on me? His eyes were sharp, knowing. That too. Richard cleared his throat. Actually, I have some news too. He pulled out his phone, showed them an email. I'm stepping back from daily operations at the company, promoting Johnson to CEO. Richard, Mr. Harrison started. It's time, Father. I've missed too much already. He looked around the garden. Some things are more important than business deals. Later, as the sun set, they sat on the patio drinking coffee that Sarah had made. Mr. Harrison dozed in his chair, peaceful. Thank you, Richard said quietly. For what? For showing me what I almost lost. What I can still save. Linda squeezed her daughter's hand. She has that effect on people. That night, back home, Sarah found a small package in her backpack. Inside was a leather-bound book, the Wordsworth First Edition. A note fell out, written in Mr. Harrison's shaky hand. Dear Sarah, some books, like some people, find us exactly when we need them. Martha would want you to have this. Keep it in your dorm room. Let it remind you of home, both homes. With love, James Harrison P.S. The lavender needs weekly checking. I trust you'll remember. Sarah placed the book carefully on her nightstand, next to Jane Eyre. Through her window, she could see the moon rising. Somewhere across the city, in a garden slowly coming back to life, the same moon shone on roses and lavender, on memories and new beginnings. Tomorrow she'd start planning what to plant by the birdbath. Something that would bloom year after year, marking time's passage with color and life. Something to remind them all that even in winter, spring waits beneath the soil, patient and full of promise. Sarah's last shift at the coffee shop felt strange. The morning rush was the same as always. The hiss of the espresso machine, the chime of the door, the rhythm of orders and payments. But everything carried the weight of endings. You're quiet today, Jenny said, bumping Sarah's shoulder as they restocked cups. Just thinking about your fancy university. About everything. Sarah arranged the cups in perfect rows. It feels weird. Leaving. The regulars had heard she was going. All morning, they'd been stopping to say goodbye. Mr. Williams, true to form, came in at exactly 6:30. The usual? Sarah asked, already reaching for his cup. For the last time, he dropped a 20 in the tip jar. You'll do great things, Sarah. Remember us little people when you're running the world. By noon, the counter was crowded with small gifts, cards, bookmarks, a coffee mug with Future Professor written on it. Jenny had ordered a cake that said, Goodbye Sarah, in green frosting. Speech, someone called out during her break. Sarah stood awkwardly behind the counter. I'm not good at speeches. Just say what's in your heart, Jenny prompted. Sarah looked around at the familiar faces. This place, it's been more than a job. You've all been part of my journey. Every tip, every kind word, every moment you let me study during breaks. She swallowed hard. Thank you. After her shift, Sarah changed out of her green employee shirt for the last time. Jenny hugged her tight. Don't be a stranger, Jenny said. Come back and visit. I will. Outside, Richard's car was waiting. Ready for your next stop? Sarah nodded. They drove to the Harrison house in comfortable silence. The garden came into view, blooming in the August heat. Mr. Harrison sat in his usual spot, but today he wore a suit. His good suit, Maria had told Sarah, the one he'd worn to give lectures. "There's my star pupil," he called out. His voice was strong today. "A good day." Sarah sat beside him, all ready for our afternoon reading. "Actually," he pulled out a folder, "I thought I might give one last lecture. If you'd indulge an old professor." Sarah's throat tightened. "I'd be honored." Richard and Maria brought out chairs. Linda arrived from her shift at the hospital, still in her scrubs. They formed a small semicircle on the lawn. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat. "When I first started teaching at Riverside, I was terrified. Standing in front of all those young minds, trying to share not just knowledge, but understanding." He looked at Sarah. "But then Martha told me something I never forgot. She said, 'James, don't teach them about books. Teach them about life, and use books to do it.'" He opened the folder. "I've been working on this for weeks, during my good moments." Richard helped type it up. The pages shook slightly in his hands as he read. "To my last and most unexpected student, you came into our lives like a character in one of our beloved books, at exactly the right moment, for exactly the right reasons. Like Elizabeth Bennet, you saw beyond surface impressions. Like Jane Eyre, you followed your conscience. Like all great literary heroines, you changed the lives around you through simple acts of kindness. But unlike those characters, you are wonderfully, perfectly real. You've taught me as much as I've taught you. You showed me that memory lies not just in the mind, but in the heart, in the soil of a restored garden, in the steam rising from a perfectly made cup of coffee. When I forget things, and I will forget more, we all know this, I want you to remember something. Some lessons can't be lost. Some connections can't be broken. Even when I can't recall your name, I will know you by the lavender you planted, by the roses you helped save, by the light you brought back to this house. You're going to Riverside now, starting your own story. But remember what Martha always said, the best stories are the ones we write together." His voice cracked. Richard stood quickly, but Sarah was already there, steadying the papers. "Would you like me to read the rest?" she asked softly. Mr. Harrison nodded. Sarah took the pages, continued where he'd left off. "So go, learn, grow. Become the professor you're meant to be. Share your love of books with a new generation. But know that this garden will always be waiting for you. These books will always be here. And no matter what happens to my memories, my heart will remember the girl who saw an old man in need and chose to stop. With all my love, and Martha's too, wherever she's watching from." Professor James Harrison, there wasn't a dry eye in the garden. Even Maria, who'd seen everything in her years with the family, wiped tears away. "I have something too," Sarah said. She went to the bird bath where she'd been working earlier. "Come see what I planted." They gathered around the newly turned soil. Tiny green shoots were already reaching up. "Forget-me-nots," Sarah explained. "They'll bloom every spring." "Blue," Mr. Harrison said softly. "Like Martha's eyes." Richard put an arm around his father's shoulders. "They'll be beautiful." They had dinner together, one last time before Sarah left for university. Maria outdid herself. All of Mr. Harrison's favorites, plus a chocolate cake that made Sarah's mother ask for the recipe. As the evening wound down, Sarah found herself back in the garden. The setting sun painted everything gold, just like that first day months ago. Mr. Harrison joined her, moving slowly but steadily. "Penny, for your thoughts." "I'm scared," Sarah admitted. "Of leaving. Of things changing." "Oh." He sat on their bench. "Want to know a secret? I was scared too, every first day of classes. But fear means you're doing something important. What if you forget me while I'm gone?" "Impossible." He touched the forget-me-nots. "You're part of this garden now. Part of our story." Richard appeared with coffee cups. "Dad's special blend," he said, handing them out. "Sarah's perfect brew." They sat together as darkness fell, drinking coffee and watching stars appear above the garden. Tomorrow would bring changes, dorm rooms, class schedules, new chapters beginning. But tonight was for this, family, found and made, sharing one last evening in a garden brought back to life. Finally, it was time to go. Sarah hugged Maria. "Richard, Mr. Harrison. Weekly garden updates," Richard promised. "And you can visit any weekend you want." "Take care of him," Sarah whispered. "We will. You take care of yourself." Mr. Harrison held her longest. "Make us proud," he said, "though you already have." In the car, driving home, Sarah's mother was quiet for a while. Then she said, "You know, I was worried when you first told me about helping a stranger that day. Thought it was dangerous, maybe naive. And now I think it was fate, or grace, or whatever you want to call it when the right people find each other at the right time." Sarah touched her backpack, where Mr. Harrison's Wordsworth lay carefully wrapped. "Like a good book finding you exactly when you need it." Exactly like that. The next morning, Sarah made coffee one last time in their small kitchen. The sunrise painted the walls gold, just as it had every morning for years. Her mother came out, already dressed for her shift. "Ready?" Sarah poured 2 cups, handed one over. "Ready." They drank their coffee together, watching the city wake up. In a garden across town, Sarah knew the morning light would be touching roses and lavender, forget-me-nots and memories, all growing together in the promise of a new day. Some stories end, some continue. The best ones do both, changing lives even as they become part of who we are. Sarah picked up her bags, hugged her mother goodbye, and stepped out into her next chapter.